A drunk producer tried to pull Lennon off the stage. He did it, and the entire stadium fell silent. New York City, 1974. Madison Square Garden. The city's beating heart, pulsing with the raw electric energy of 20,000 souls united by a single purpose: music. John Lennon stood at the microphone, bathed in the cold glare of spotlights, his guitar slung low, his eyes scanning the vast, heaving crowd. He was performing a rare, unannounced solo concert, a surprise appearance that had sent shockwaves through New York's music community. Word had spread like wildfire through the city's underground channels. John Lennon, tonight, Madison Square Garden. The crowd was incandescent, a sea of faces, wide-eyed with disbelief and joy, stretching back into the darkness beyond the stage lights. But John felt it. Beneath the euphoria, a dark undercurrent. A tension that had nothing to do with the audience. It emanated from the wings. Then his lost weekend was in full, chaotic swing. The period of separation from Yoko, marked by heavy drinking, late nights, and the relentless company of industry figures who saw in John's vulnerability an opportunity. Men who attached themselves to his fame like barnacles to a ship's hull, professing friendship while calculating profit. One such man was Vincent "Vinny" Caruso, a mid-level record producer with an inflated reputation, a perpetual glass of bourbon in his hand, and a dangerous sense of entitlement. Vinny had inserted himself into John's circle during those dark, untethered months, whispering promises of creative freedom while quietly maneuvering for control. He had secured backstage access through a combination of charm, manipulation, and connections John barely remembered sanctioning. Tonight, Vinny was drunk, dangerously, unpredictably drunk. As John launched into the opening chords of Working Class Hero, his voice raw and honest against the backdrop of 20,000 listening souls, Vinny paced backstage, his mind a carnival of grievances. He had convinced himself, in the twisted logic of alcohol, that John was performing songs he didn't have rights to produce, that tonight's concert was cutting him out of a deal, that John Lennon owed him something, and Vinny Caruso intended to collect. He pushed past a roadie. He shoved aside a security guard who didn't recognize him, and moved with a lumbering, unstoppable certainty towards the stage. The music was everything. The crowd was everything. 20,000 people breathing in perfect synchrony with a man whose voice carried the weight of a generation. Then the darkness from the wings moved. What happened next would last mere seconds, but those seconds would reveal the raw, unyielding courage of an icon who refused to be moved. On the fragile line between art and chaos, and the profound, terrifying power of a moment when the music stops. A drunk producer tried to pull Lennon off the stage, and he did something that made the entire stadium fall silent. John Lennon's lost weekend was a period his biographers would later describe with careful, clinical distance. But to those who lived through it alongside him, it was something raw, more jagged, more dangerous. Separated from Yoko Ono, under the anchor of his creative and emotional world, John found himself adrift in Los Angeles and later New York, surrounded by a shifting constellation of companions, collaborators, and opportunists. May Pang, his companion during this period, later spoke of the constant influx of industry figures who materialized around John during his most vulnerable hours. Some were genuine, old friends, fellow musicians, people who loved him for his art, but others were predators dressed as patrons, miscircling the wounded genius, sensing opportunity in his disorientation. Vincent Caruso occupied this second category with particular skill. He was 43, broad-shouldered, with the remnants of a once handsome face now blurred by decades of excess. He had produced minor hits for forgettable acts throughout the 1960s. His career sustained more by his network of relationships than by any genuine creative vision. When John Lennon drifted into his orbit during a late-night session at Record Plant Studios, Vinnie had recognized the moment with the instincts of a seasoned opportunist. He had been warm, funny, disarmingly down-to-earth. He had told stories about the old days, about the music that had made them both who they were. He had made John laugh in the specific, surprised way of someone who hadn't expected to laugh. And John, lonely and unmoored, had let him in. But what Vinnie had cultivated as friendship, John had merely tolerated as company. And that distinction, misread, misunderstood, had been festering in Vinnie's alcohol-soaked mind for months. He believed himself a partner. John barely remembered agreeing to any partnership. The concert tonight had crystallized Vinnie's resentment into something uglier. John had organized the show through different channels, through people who didn't include Vinnie, who didn't need Vinnie, or who perhaps deliberately excluded Vinnie. Backstage, Vinnie had started drinking at 5 in the afternoon. By the time John took the stage, he was 3 bottles deep into a darkness that had nothing to do with the auditorium's lighting. The security team was stretched thin, focused on the crowd, on the front of house, on the 1,000 potential crises that a sold-out Madison Square Garden presented. The backstage security was looser, more informal. Vinnie's presence in the building was known. His access passes, though questionable, were real. No one stopped him as he moved toward the stage. No one saw the catastrophe gathering in the wings. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. The third song of the set. Jealous Guy. John had introduced it with characteristic dry humor and a single quiet sentence into the microphone. This one's for everyone I've ever hurt by being an idiot. The crowd had laughed, then fallen silent, because the opening notes demanded silence, demanded presence, demanded that every person in that vast arena arrive fully at the moment. John sang with his eyes closed. This was when he was most himself. No performance, no persona. Just the truth of the lyric, the rawness of the melody, the trembling vulnerability of a man confessing in front of 20,000 witnesses. The crowd was absolutely still, the particular stillness of people who understand they are witnessing something real. The song reached its bridge, John's voice climbing, cracking slightly on the highest note, in a way that felt completely intentional, completely human. And then the hand came from the dark. Vinnie Caruso stumbled onto the stage from the left wing, in his face a mask of bourbon-soaked indignation. He moved with the terrible momentum of someone who had convinced himself of his own righteousness. His hand closed around John's left arm, just above the elbow, fingers gripping, pulling. "Off!" Vinnie growled, loud enough to be heard by the nearest band members. "You're done. We're done. I'm pulling you off this stage right now, Lennon." The music died. Not gradually, not professionally. It simply collapsed. One by one, the musicians faltered, loud confused, their instruments going silent as they registered the extraordinary scene unfolding at the front of the stage. 20,000 people watched the music stop. They watched a large, swaying man attempting to physically remove John Lennon from his own stage. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Madison Square Garden had ever held. It was the silence of collective shock, of 20,000 minds simultaneously failing to process what their eyes were showing them. John Lennon felt the hand on his arm. He felt the pull. He stood completely, absolutely still. He did not resist. He did not struggle. He did not recoil. He simply stopped moving, stopped singing, stopped being anything other than a man who had just been grabbed in front of his entire audience and who was now making a very deliberate, very conscious choice about what to do next. Vinny pulled again, harder. His bourbon logic demanded compliance. John Lennon looked down at the hand on his arm. Then slowly, with the measured calm of someone who had faced down governments, presidents, and the full machinery of state censorship, he raised his eyes, and he looked at Vinny, not with anger, not with fear, with something far more devastating, understanding. The silence stretched beyond what silence normally permits. It was elastic, vast, breathing. 20,000 people did not move, did not speak. Some later described it as the most disorienting moment of their lives, the sensation of being present at something that had no script, no precedent, no guidebook for how to respond. Vinnie Caruso, in the grip of his alcohol-fueled certainty, had not anticipated this particular response. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps a shout, perhaps a shove, perhaps the intervention of security, which would at least validate his sense of persecution, confirm that John Lennon was afraid of him and was hiding something from him. He had not anticipated stillness. John's stillness was not passive. It was the most active thing in the building. It radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Every person in that arena felt it. Every camera operator, every roadie, every security guard frozen in stunned uncertainty felt it. John removed Vinny's hand from his arm. Not roughly, not dramatically, with the same quiet deliberateness with which you might remove a stone from your path. He held the man's wrist for a moment, a gesture of containment rather than aggression. Then he turned to face him fully. "Vinny," John said, his voice carried by the microphone still clipped to his shirt, amplified into every corner of the vast arena. His voice was quiet, conversational, as though they were the only two people in the room. "What do you think you're doing, mate?" Vinny's bravado flickered. The word mate landed strangely, too human, too ordinary. He had prepared for confrontation and been offered something else entirely. "You cut me out," Vinny slurred, his voice cracking into the microphone, his grievances suddenly exposed to 20,000 strangers. "I made you. I helped you. And you just walked away like I was nothing." The words echoed through the arena and fell away into silence. John studied him. Something in his face shifted. The cold clarity of confrontation, giving way to something more complicated. The band members stood motionless, instruments hanging. The security team had finally mobilized, 3 large men moving carefully towards the stage, but John raised a single hand without looking at them, and they stopped. This was his moment, his call. He turned to the microphone, his hand still lightly on Vinny's wrist, and spoke to 20,000 people in the same tone he'd been using to sing to them. Honest, unvarnished. "I need a moment, not if you don't mind." The crowd did not respond with boos or cheers. They simply waited. Because whatever this was, it was real. and real things deserve patience. What John Lennon did next would be described differently by everyone who witnessed it. Some said it was an act of mercy. Others called it showmanship of the highest order. A few, including members of his own band, later said simply that it was the most human thing they had ever seen a man do under those particular circumstances. But John guided Vinnie Caruso away from the microphone with a firm, steady hand. Not to the wings, not off stage, to a chair that a quick-thinking crew member had produced from somewhere, placed stage left, out of the immediate spotlight, but visible to the audience. He sat Vinnie down with the firm gentleness of someone managing a child who doesn't yet understand the danger they've put themselves in. Then he returned to the microphone alone. The stadium waited. John ran a hand through his hair. He looked out at 20,000 faces, each one a small pale oval in the darkness beyond the stage lights. He was quiet for a long moment, his breath audible through the microphone. "Sorry about that," he said finally. The crowd released a collective, involuntary laugh. Not cruel. Something more like the laugh that comes from the sudden release of unbearable tension. John didn't smile. He remained serious, present, his eyes moving across the audience with that particular quality he had, and the ability to make each individual in a crowd of thousands feel personally seen. "That man," he said quietly, nodding toward Vinnie, who sat slumped in the chair, the alcohol and the humiliation working through him simultaneously, "is someone I know. Someone who's been having a rough time. A very rough time." A murmur moved through the crowd. "We all get lost," John continued, his voice low and steady. "Every one of us. We get confused about what we deserve, what other people owe us. We wake up at some point and realize the life we imagined and the life we're living have got nothing to do with each other. And that gap between what we dreamed and what is real, that gap will eat you alive if you let it." He looked at Vinnie, then back at the crowd. "I've been there," he said. "I'm not sure I'm entirely back." The silence that followed this admission was different from the earlier silence. That had been shock. This was recognition. The 20,000 people recognizing something true. "I'm not going to have anyone removed tonight," John said carefully. "I'm not going to make a scene bigger than it already is. What I'm going to do is finish my show. Because that's what I came here to do. And because music is the only thing I know that actually helps." He looked once more at Vinnie, whose head had dropped forward, the fight completely gone from him. "Vinnie," John said, more his voice barely above a whisper, but the microphone catching every word. "Stay, listen, it might help." Then he turned back to his guitar, and in the profound, aching silence of Madison Square Garden, he began playing Imagine. The concert continued for another hour. John played with a raw, almost frightening intensity. Every song carried the weight of the preceding confrontation, imbued with a new layer of meaning, a new urgency. The audience, shaken and transformed, listened differently, more attentively, more gratefully. Vinnie Caruso sat in his chair for the duration of the show. He did not speak, did not move, did not attempt another interruption. The security team maintained a discreet, watchful distance. By the time the final encore ended, Vinnie was crying, quietly, privately, a man who had come looking for a fight, and instead received the most devastating gift of his adult life, being seen clearly, without judgment, in the worst moment he had ever created. A crew member later recalled that as John left the stage after the final bow, he paused beside Vinnie's chair, placed a hand briefly on the man's shoulder, said something inaudible over the roar of applause still cascading through the arena. Whatever it was, Vinnie Caruso nodded, stood slowly, and walked quietly off stage, under his own power. The incident generated no formal press coverage. No arrests were made. No statements were issued. In an era before smartphones, this before the reflexive documentation of every extraordinary moment, the story spread the old way, through word of mouth, through the testimony of 20,000 witnesses, through the musicians who were on stage, who told other musicians, who told their friends. For John, the night left marks that were invisible but permanent. He spoke of it once, obliquely, in an interview conducted several months later. Asked about the relationship between fame and loneliness, he gave an answer that seemed to come from somewhere very specific. Fame doesn't make you immune to losing your way, he said. If anything, it makes the distance between who you are and who you're supposed to be even harder to navigate. The kindest thing you can do for someone who's lost is not fight them. Just stand still. Let them come back to themselves. Maypang, reflecting on the incident years later, said that the night at Madison Square Garden was a turning point. That something clarified in John after it, that he began, slowly, deliberately, to find his way back, to himself, to his art, to Yoko. The wounds of the lost weekend did not heal overnight, but they healed. And those who knew John best said the seeds of that healing were planted in the extraordinary, unlikely stillness of a man who refused to be moved from his stage by anything less than his own choice. New York City, December 8th, 1980. John Lennon was murdered 40 steps from the building where he lived, on a street he walked every day, by a man who had asked for his autograph earlier that afternoon. The world broke, and in the breaking, every story about who John Lennon truly was came flooding back. The official narratives, the Beatle mythology, the political activist, the dreamer, and the quieter stories, the ones that didn't make headlines, the ones that lived in the memories of the people who were there. The night at Madison Square Garden. I'm the drunk producer. The hand from the dark, the stillness, the chair, the whispered words, the decision not to fight. 20,000 people carried that memory. Every one of them carried it differently. Some remembered the fear of the initial confrontation. Some remembered the laughter that broke the tension. Some remembered the silence before Imagine began, and the way that particular silence felt like the pause before something sacred. What they all remembered, without exception, was the choice to respond to aggression with understanding, to answer chaos with stillness, to use the largest possible platform not to humiliate a broken man, but to offer him quietly and without fanfare a seat and a song. John Lennon was not a saint. He said so himself, more than once, with characteristic bluntness. He was a man of enormous contradictions, tremendous flaws, and an almost supernatural capacity for honesty about both. But there are moments in a person's life that reveal the deepest truth of their character, moments that strip away the myth and show the human being underneath. The night a drunk producer tried to pull him from his stage, and John Lennon responded not with rage, but with grace, was one of those moments. He did not fight, he did not flee, he did not perform strength. He simply stood still. He held a boundary without cruelty. He told the truth without violence. And then he played Imagine to 20,000 people who had just watched a man choose his better nature in real time. Madison Square Garden still stands. Its walls have absorbed the sound of 10,000 extraordinary nights. But somewhere in those walls, if you listen in the way that certain places hold memory, you can still find the echo of a particular silence. The silence that fell over 20,000 people when the music stopped. Is in the deeper silence that followed when John Lennon chose not to make it worse. No official report from that night mentions the incident. No arrest was made, no statement issued. The machine moved on, as machines always do. But 20,000 people carried the memory home, and some of them are still carrying it. A hand from the dark, a chair placed stage left, a whispered word, and then the opening notes of Imagine. The music, after everything, still won. The end.